This is my audience.
When you think of fairy tales, one of the first things that commonly comes to mind is happily ever after. Though when fairy tales originated, happy was not a term that was connected with these tales. If someone were to ask you to provide a general summary of the story of Cinderella, Snow White, or even Red Riding Hood, you could probably do it without needing to give it too much thought. Fairy tales today are recognized as Disney movies as well as bedtime stories. But what might not be common knowledge is that these tales have much darker origins and have an extensive history. With this presentation, I will talk about the history of fairy tales, and then I will briefly discuss a couple examples of original stories. Everyone knows at least one fairy tale, but how did these stories come about? When talking about the history of fairy tales, starting with the question of what is a fairy tale is a good start. These stories are structured in a way that shows amazing things can happen to anyone, impossible things can happen, things can change for the better, and good will always triumph over evil. There are some fairy tales today without a happily ever after, but there's not a single fairy tale that has not been retold or altered by another author through time. The author Warner himself said metamorphosis defines the fairy tale. So where did fairy tales come from? Fairy tales were originally a large part of traditional storytelling, which included myths, legends, and folk tales as well. Because these were originally orally told, the history of them cannot be fully traced. Once fairy tales were put into print, they were actually preserved and considered literature. Dr. Jamie Tierney is an anthropologist who studied tales from different cultures and has been tracing the historical timeline of them. According to her study, there are 35 versions that have been found of Little Red Riding Hood throughout the world, and the oldest dates back 2,600 years. Each version is culturally adapted to the area that it was found in, various locations such as Japan, Korea, China, Iran, and Nigeria. According to an article from the Kennedy Center, Charles Perrault was one of the first to put these tales into a published literary form. He published Tales of Mother Goose in 1697. His stories that he published were not entirely written by him. He just put his own twist on the stories that had been passed down. The Grimm brothers published their book in 1812. Their goal was collecting and preserving oral stories told all over the world. Their collection contained 210 stories that they had collected. H.C. Andersen is the final one I'll talk about, published his book in 1835. In his book, he did have some of the traditional stories that have been passed down, such as The Princess and the Pea, but most of his stories were originals. Fairy tales are often revised and retold by different writers, giving different twists to the tales. Now that I have addressed how fairy tales came about, I will discuss a couple examples of the original tales. Original fairy tales were not happy endings that are depicted in the fairy tales we see today. Original fairy tales were dark and were aimed more at adults than children because of the topics they involved, such as rape, incest, torture, cannibalism, and other horrific events, according to Ogden's Huffington Post article. Many of these stories are derived from different historic events. The Grimm brothers and Perrault collections had a lot of stories based on actual events that had happened, according to the book Once Upon a Time on the Nature of Fairy Tales. Perrault's Bluebeard is based on the actions of a nobleman and knight in Brittany, France. The nobleman himself tortured, mutilated, raped, and murdered hundreds of innocent children. The Pied Piper was based off of an actual event that happened in a small German village in 1264. They had 130 of their children disappear. There are two ideas of why these children might have disappeared. The first one was a man carrying the bubonic plague, which would explain his rats, and his pied, which is the skin color and lesions brought about from the later stages of the plague itself. The second option, considered because the children were not, or only the children were exposed to the plague, was the Children's Crusade, which was a common occurrence at these times. Today I've discussed where fairy tales originated from, as well as how the origin stories are much darker than the stories we know today. Fairy tales today are recognized as Disney movies and as bedtime stories, but what might not be common knowledge is that they were tales much darker and with much more history than we know. In conclusion, the original fairy tales are only small pieces of the fairy tales we now today know. These stories came from spoken stories and eventually passed down to stories, leading to them being altered a little by each person. Almost every classic fairy tale known has a dark twist or original plot. Ta-da!